Hi, I'm Lizzie, here with my friend Andrea, and we're your hosts for Letting It Percolate. Just as the best tasting coffee takes time to percolate, some of life's most interesting and important questions take time to truly explore. And that's what we're going to do today. So, Andrea, what's the question today?
The question we're covering today is, should we condemn or praise singleness? And yeah, we're excited to dive into this. To kick us off, as I was doing some background research on this topic, I stumbled upon an article from the Wall Street Journal called The Art of Being Single by Elizabeth Bernstein. And one of the just statistics that she gave in the article was that in 2017, 48% of adult Americans fell into the category of divorced, never married, or widowed, which basically equates to singleness. So 48% of adult Americans in 2017 were single. And I found that kind of striking. It seemed a little high, maybe higher than I would have guessed. But I think it kind of speaks to the relevance of this topic of singleness for a lot of us. Also in my research, and I think Lizzie, you mentioned this too, we both started to see this attitude. Sometimes it was subtle, but sometimes it was a little bit more bold, of needing to defend singleness for people who maybe are more on the praising singleness end of the spectrum. There seemed to be this underlying theme of there's something about singleness that we need to protect or advocate for or stand up for. And that kind of led us to this question of what's going on there that we think we need to defend singleness. Is it being attacked from the other side? Are people insecure about singleness? It kind of led to these kinds of questions. So, that kind of kicks off where this idea for the podcast episode came from.
Yeah, and obviously there's a lot there. Like, as soon as you ask, like, are there people who criticize, like, people who are single, or are there elements of or parts of society who are harsh toward single people or make people who are single feel bad? Like, the answer is, like, yes. And there's so obviously but there's just so much there to unpack between, like, different subcultures and how we view, like, singleness and marriage and what happens in both of those, like, whether you're single or married or so.
Well, going off of that, like, so for people who maybe fall into the realm of a more negative attitude or approach towards singleness, what are some of the stereotypes that you've heard from people with those beliefs?
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes from less of, like, an intentional wanting to hate on people who are single and more from a, like, over glorification of marriage. And so therefore feeling like, oh, if you're single, you're, like, incomplete, or you aren't, like, able to contribute to, like, society and families in the same way as a married person, or maybe there's something wrong with you if you're single. Maybe you're, like, middle-aged and you're single. I know, like, myself, I would not assume that I have those views, but sometimes I find myself slipping into thinking about those stereotypical things. Like, oh, why is this person still single? And it's like, why am I thinking that? Like, I don't want to think that. And I'm aware that, like, being single is a perfectly valid way to live. And there's many reasons for it. And I'm single. And so, like,
oh yeah, and that.
But
I say that on both of our behalves, by the way.
It just speaks to the, like, I think the depth of that stereotype and that message that society, I think Christian circles, but also American society at large in many ways, just, like, promotes marriage to the exclusion of singleness being a viable, valid way to live.
You know, I can remember I don't know if you've experienced this. I can remember in my first job out of college talking to one of my coworkers, and he was in a relationship, and I shared like, oh, I'm not like dating anyone, and I'm just single, and he kind of like did this, oh, so you're single and ready to mingle thing, and I was like, no. like there was this kind of assumption that if someone's single, they're waiting for that, like they're eager and ready for that opportunity to be in a relationship. And at that point in my life, and to be honest, a lot of points in my life, that is not where I've been at. And it does frustrate me when someone hears that and then thinks, oh, well, like, you're just waiting, hoping that your next relationship is right around the corner. And that's not true. In fact, when going back to that Wall Street Journal article, I remember they broke down within that 50% roughly of people who are single, what percentage were wanting to be in some kind of relationship, including casual dating, and what percent weren't. And it was actually a 50-50 split. Like half of the people who are adult singles don't want to be in a relationship right now. And I find that interesting and kind of noteworthy too, as far as assumptions go.
Right. Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of assumptions, like you said, and also feeling misunderstood within singles. Not that I'm some sort of spokesperson by any means, but
I, Wizzy, as representative of the singles of the world.
But yeah, I think going back to just the stereotypes and messaging from culture, like big overarching culture, and also culture within certain groups. And obviously, like, you and I don't know the ins and outs of how every subculture and subgroup in America like views singleness, because we don't have like full access to those, but there's just a lot of variation there, I feel like.
You mentioned this a little while back, the role of marriage and the degree to which it's glorified does seem to have an impact on how singleness is perceived. Would you say, can you think of any like subcultures or categories, I guess, of people that you're a part of where marriage is elevated or you've seen it glorified to a certain extent?
Yeah, I think the biggest response to that just like jumps out in my mind would be like certain Christian circles. And it's hard because it's like such a nuanced thing, because it's not as if anyone's trying to say marriage is bad. At least in these Christian, like there's good reason to elevate marriage and to promote like, hey, like go find someone to build a life with and have a family. But I think that can become like promoted, like I said, just to an extreme level, in a way where it's just like unhealthy and like an idol and an end in and of itself. Like once you're married, then you can really live, or then your real life can begin. We definitely have Disney princess movies to thank for that message as well.
True dat.
So yeah, it's not just Christian or certain Christian cultures. It's also in like broader society, but it's also more nuanced too, because there are, and I know you've talked about this, there are some churches that are growing a lot and being very nuanced in how they talk about singleness and marriage and not elevating marriage beyond what it should be, and being intentional to include single people and make them feel welcome and valued in church. So that's encouraging to see, because I think that is a little bit more rare, but becoming more, it's happening more, which is good.
Yes, I would agree. I might share a little bit more about that later, but yeah, especially in the past, I don't know, I'd probably say the past year, like roughly since I began attending a certain church, I've seen a lot of more positive and like non-extreme views of marriage, and I appreciate that. One thing sorry, this is like a little tangent, but one thing that I've heard a lot of people in Christian circles say, specifically parents of daughters, is, oh, we've prayed for your future husband, or we're praying for your future husband until the day that you meet him. Or things like, oh, well, it didn't work out, honey, but he just wasn't the one, and God has someone, and you just have to keep praying. And those are not true statements. There is no guarantee in the Bible that anyone will have a spouse. And in fact, as we see in the life of Jesus and the life of Paul, singleness is strongly encouraged and exhorted at certain places in the Bible, which that's not to say it's elevated above marriage, although, yeah, depending on how you interpret some of Paul's writings. Okay, so there's some nuance and some
yeah, it's also contextual too, like
yes.
who you're talking to, there
is some liberty there with different authors, but I think that mindset of every woman has a future husband and she just has to wait to encounter him, I think that's set us up as single people for some of that feeling of being broken or like we're missing something, because it's this implicit message that's been taught. Again, I don't want to generalize by any means, but in some Christian circles that has been taught. So I don't know, I find that interesting, and I think about sometimes, if I am a mom in the future, how would I and I'll also say this, my own mother did not say these things, but I think having heard them from other parents, I would approach it differently if I have a daughter in the future. So
yeah, I have mixed feelings, because on one hand, I think praying for your daughter's future husband is like a good thing, because statistically speaking, it's likely that she'll have a partner in the future, and that's a beautiful thing to pray maybe not for it to happen, but just for the person she would be with. So I can understand that, though, whether or not you talk about it with your daughter, I don't know where I stand on that. I'm not in a position to have kids anytime soon, so but I always have a weird feeling when people tell me that I will get married, because I'm I really want to have access to whatever certain knowledge you have access to right now, because I don't know, I can't see the future, and I don't think you can. And I appreciate the heart behind it, because I would like to get married, and that can coexist with being single, and I don't know, just I think people sometimes feel awkward or don't know what to say, and they want to make you feel better, or maybe sometimes it's coming from even more of a pure place. But in effect, it does feel always a little strange, because I'm you don't actually know the future.
Right. And I appreciate that comment, because I think there's a way to receive statements like that with grace and appreciate the sentiment behind it without maybe in the moment, as might be my tendency, to call out, that's not a true thing that you just said. But yeah, I think that's helpful even for me to hear, how can we have a gracious approach toward those kinds of statements, knowing that we probably make our own versions of those statements in other contexts, and people are gracious with us too. So
yes, amen. Oh my gosh, Yes. I certainly make those kind of like declarations in other contexts, and I just don't realize it because no one calls me out.
Sometimes I think it's a good thing we can't read people's minds.
Yes, I would hate that. To everyone who wants to read people's minds as a superpower, when people ask that icebreaker question, I don't understand you. Why would you ever want to read someone's mind? Oh, I would hate that. And I'm a therapist, so you'd think that'd be useful, but no, I would hate that. Any hoodles. So going back to marriage and singleness.
There was one thing I wanted to chime in on a little bit outside of just like a Christian subculture view of marriage, but this was a trend that someone in a podcast that we both listen to often, Gospel Bound podcast, someone who was speaking on that shared these two models of marriage that he's kind of seen trending just amongst, I think it was millennials, I don't know specifically. His name's Mark Rigneris, and he wrote a book called The Future of Christian Marriage, but again, this was outside of just Christian circles. So there's the capstone model of marriage, which perceives marriage as kind of like this optional icing on the cake. The idea is you start by accomplishing these different rungs on the ladder for yourself. So that might be graduating from college, getting a job, getting an apartment, maybe even putting a down payment on a house, getting to a place where you're comfortable in your career, a city that you could see yourself settling down in. And then and paying off debt. That was a big one. Mm-hmm. And when you finally get there and you arrive, then you may start to consider marriage. And he even suggested some people might see the rungs as requirements to be an attractive marriage partner, to have those other things in place, which I found interesting. And then he contrasted that with the foundational model of marriage, which I associate more with like my grandparents' generation, where they may have gotten married right out of high school or maybe part of the way through college, possibly didn't have like steady jobs at the time, maybe had a lot of debt, likely didn't own a house, probably still living in an apartment, or maybe even in some cases with their parents. But this idea of they're kind of working through and molding a life together as one unit versus two separate and pretty established entities that are then coming together later when they feel like they're ready for it. And I found both of those interesting, and I definitely, especially as I think back on my time in business school and would talk to people who were dating, I was surprised sometimes that they would say, oh, I'm really not thinking about marrying this person for like 8 more years. I kind of want to like get into my career, figure out where I want to be, and then we'll talk about it. And so I definitely have witnessed firsthand the capstone, and I see some of that in myself too. Like, let me get all my ducks in a row, and then maybe I'll be ready to think about marriage.
Yeah, those aren't like the only two ways, like you've said before, like these are not the only two models for like what marriage means and looks like, but I think it's a fairly comprehensive, like just two options. I think one question that these two models raise is, what does it mean to be ready for marriage? And what even is marriage? Obviously it's like the union of two people, but beyond like the substance of it, like what is it and when are you ready for it, I think are more profound questions that I don't know how well we all, like, meaning millennial, I'll just speak for our generation, millennials, I don't know how well we've been like prepared to contend with marriage and deciding when, if you're with someone, if you're dating someone, how to know when you're ready for that next step. Because I think there's a lot of fear. I can understand fear to enter into like that foundational model of like, yeah, we're going to tie the knot right down. We don't really have a solid plan. Well, maybe you have a plan, but you don't have anything marked off on it yet. and now you're bound to someone, which is like a negative way to look at it, but I can understand that fear.
You're my ball and chains, honey.
Oh, wow. Oh. So,
you know, oh.
No, go ahead.
I don't want to take this too existential, but
Please
I think even beyond the question, like, when are you ready for marriage, is anyone ever ready for marriage? Like, does there even exist a threshold when someone is mature enough or self-sacrificing enough or humble enough to be married? Like, I don't know. I wonder what married couples would say. Like, do they feel that they were ready for marriage? Would they have delayed it? Do they think there was any way that they could have prepared themselves for marriage that they didn't already do? Dang, we should have had a guest host of a married couple on this show.
Yeah, I feel like you're never going to be... It depends... The other question the even bigger, like, philosophical question is, what does ready mean in this context? Because I agree with what you're getting at of, like, no one's ever going to be, like, arrived in terms of I'm, like, the best version of myself that will enter into the best, most healthy, effective partnership with another human. Like, you're never going to arrive because we're broken people. And so the answer is, like, you're never going to be ready in the way we typically use ready. But I think there's legitimacy to, there are things you can do to be better prepared, or more ready, and how much of that I guess the question is, like, how much of that to do before saying now we can get married. So,
man, if you can't cook your own food and do your own laundry, there's gonna be problems in that marriage, let me tell you.
Oh, man. Yeah. So that was an interesting tangent on marriage. I think that segues nicely into, like, we were going to talk about, I think loneliness is a often cited, like, issue, quote unquote, with singleness. Interestingly enough, married people can feel lonely too. In talking with friends who are married, or older people in my life who are married, like, that's just a fact. But sticking with the particular type of loneliness that single people can experience, what thoughts do you have about that, Andrea, and what impact that may have with how people feel about being single, or how society feels about people being single?
I think this is kind of basic, but it is, I say this with very little experience and having this kind of a relationship, but it is nice to have someone to go to as a default who, you know, like, has your best interests in mind, and that wouldn't be bothered by you calling them at any point during the day to talk. And I have those kinds of relationships, and I'd say my mom is definitely one of them. I also feel like you're one of them. But, like, yeah, they're kind of few and far between, and so I think there is a loneliness there. Maybe in seasons where even those people who normally would be really close seem distant for whatever reason. There's a loneliness and feeling like I should probably keep my thoughts to myself. I don't even know if there's someone out there who would want to hear me process through this right now. So I've experienced that, definitely.
Yeah.
Can you think of any circumstances where you've really felt lonely or experienced loneliness?
Yeah, I would echo that last thought that you shared of just having, like, something you want to process through, or, like, you're thinking about, or you experience something, and then having the thought, like, I don't actually know if anyone would choose to be burdened by this right now. Like, if I should reach out to anyone. Because it is, like, the thing that you were getting at with, like, how it's nice. And again, it's coming from someone who's not been married. But nice to have that person where it's maybe just more like convenient. Like you don't have to plan and reach out. Like I am so blessed to have amazing friends, including you, and family members who I can talk to, but it's always like reaching out, and then there's always that thought of like, well, does this person, like, can this person handle this right now, or like am I burdening them? And maybe I should just like keep this to myself, which is like one of the most painful thoughts for me, because I like am an external processor and I like people, but yeah, I have that thought too, and that can be hard. And it's interesting though, because even like when my circumstances, if you look at it from like an external point of view, like don't change, I can be in a mode where I am experiencing more loneliness subjectively, like feeling that aloneness in a sad way. But then I can also be in the same exact like circumstances, but feeling like the joy of solitude and like not having anyone to report to, and and enjoying like, oh, I guess I'll just like detour today and like play some music, or I'll get fast food because I can do that and it's my money, and like I don't have to, you know, that's kind of the selfish part of it. That goes into the selfish part of it sometimes. But it's interesting that whether our circumstances might be the same, but we might feel subjectively more lonely or feel more like okay in our, you know, singleness.
You know, there's another situation that I can think of feeling maybe more aware of my singleness, or like wishing, I wish I had that sidekick or that like partner to talk to. And that's like new social settings where other people do have that person. And I think of specifically church, like visiting a new church. I think visiting a new church as a single person is very intimidating, especially if you don't know anyone there. Like you're kind of sitting by yourself on the pew, like making awkward eye contact with people after the service. Like, are we going to talk to each other and say hi? And for some reason, having someone to share in that with, I think, one, sometimes it could be almost more approachable. Like, oh, they're a couple, like they're normal people because they're interacting with at least one other human being right now. But yeah, you're just like, you can kind of derive strength from each other and that experience. So I felt it there. Also, not that this like comes up super often, but if you're at like a wedding, for example, of someone that you know well, but you don't really know any of the wedding like party or the other people there, that can be a lonely place. I mean, not just because it's a wedding, like, yes, but also because you don't have anyone you go with. And it's like, okay, everyone can gravitate toward their boyfriend or toward their husband or their cousin, but like, here I am, like the awkward single one who doesn't want to over insert myself into someone's conversation, but also doesn't particularly want to just stand here in the corner of the dance floor and like make subtle dance movement. Like, maybe this is only me.
No, I
Dude,
totally
I need
get
to
what you're
study
saying.
some TikTok dance moves before my next wedding.
That's a good idea, actually. No, yeah, I agree with you. I think I've arrived at a certain like mental space in, again, granted, I haven't visited a church since like January because like COVID. You might ask, well, February, but yeah, I wasn't going to church in February. Another story for another time. But I have, yes, going to a new church by yourself for me has also been intimidating historically. And at this point, I've arrived at a sort of like, to use a term from therapy, this is dialectical behavioral therapy, radical acceptance of it is what it is. And guess what? Yeah, I'm alone. And yeah, I'm sitting alone. I'm the only person in this pew. This has happened before. I'm the only person in this pew, and this church is not small. But it is what it is. And church should be a place, and there are other contexts too, besides like religious contexts, where you would be in a group, and it's supposed to be a place where people can feel welcome, and you don't have to be anxious because people are going to like shun you because you're sitting alone in a pew. That's the hope, at least. And so I've kind of decided, like, I'm just gonna be like content in this, and like I'm gonna look at people, not awkwardly, but like I'm not gonna
Speak
like
for yourself.
not gonna like shyly kind of like meep about because I want someone to talk to me, because yeah, I feel like, especially in church, like Christians have a duty to their like brothers and sisters in Christ, to whether you know them or not, like. And you don't even know if they're a Christian. Like, maybe they're just checking out the church. Like, wouldn't you want them to feel welcome? And so I kind of mentally put the onus on other people as much as I put it on myself. And that helps me feel better. Because it is hard. There's no getting around that. But, yeah.
You know, I appreciate that reframe. Like, you're not destined to have an awful church visit experience because you're single. Like, the church is about so much more than your relationship status.
Yeah.
As are, like, our Christian faith in general, as is. So, yeah, like, first and foremost, we're going to church to worship God and to be in fellowship with believers. And those things can definitely happen regardless of relationship status or marriage status. So, yeah, good reframe, Lizzie. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. So I think the other, like, bigger thing we wanted to, like, just briefly talk about with singleness as the topic of this episode. So we'd posed the question, like, condemning or praising. And obviously those are like two extremes that we've noticed in just society and articles we've read and interactions and conversations we've had. Andrea stumbled upon some interesting concepts on the more like extreme end of like singleness is awesome. Let's like make it the end all be all kind of. Did you want to say anything about that? What you found there?
Sure. Yeah, it was really interesting and kind of eye-opening and good to be aware of where some people fall on this spectrum. So there was, I forget what the source was, but there was an article that interviewed Emma Watson. She's one of the people who talked about this idea of self-partnership. And I guess self-partnership is the idea that within each of us is everything that we would need to complete ourselves and to live fully and abundantly, and anyone who would bring toxicity into our pursuit of what I really think is self-actualization. I think that's kind of what they're getting at. Anyone who would bring I cannot say that word, toxicity into that should be avoided and cut off. So there's that idea, and then this was a little bit more of like a quirky side idea, but we both found it kind of funny. There is a group in England called the Sinkies, which stands for Single Income No Kids, and then IES at the end.
To make it cute.
I mean, it's something. I don't know if it's cute. But just, it's this idea that we're this group of people who is intentionally choosing to support ourselves financially with a career and to not have kids. And we're, like sharing this bond together and appreciating living and pursuing our dreams, going on adventures, that kind of thing. And there are definitely some positive aspects to both of these ideas. I think learning not to depend on someone else for total happiness or for honestly just being like entertained, like being able to entertain yourself or keep yourself productive, like those are good things, I would say. But as some might suspect, there definitely seems to be some potential hazards walking down toward this end of the spectrum. I I don't want to say too much without giving you a chance to speak about these, Lizzie. So do you have any additional thoughts about pros or cons of self-partnership or the Sinkies idea?
Well, I like the Sinkies name. I will say that. I think they're really cute. And I don't say that patronizingly. I mean that genuinely. I think they're cute. Yeah, I think some of, like, kind of just echoing what you said, really, some of the, like, ideas within self-partnership I, like, am on board with, as far as basically just, like, having, you know, basically, like, building your own character and building your own, like, strength and accountability. I think those are good things. But I also think that those things pursued, like, in isolation to their end would produce someone, I don't know, I just don't think that that would really produce what people hope it would, namely someone who is, like, warm and gracious and kind. Just because I know I have a tendency toward, like, if I am out of community and outside of just, like, regular having to, like, sacrifice of myself, not that I like to do that, obviously. It's painful, but it's good because it forces me to not be selfish. And yeah, I think building, I'm not saying that people who, like, promote or identifying with the self-partnership concept are selfish at all, per se. I'm just saying that I think that some of the ideas pursued in isolation could lead to that. Because at least my view of life as a Christian is, like, that I'm not self-sufficient. And it's beautiful because even if I'm single for the rest of my life, that's, like, the point is not to have another, another human, like, fulfill me, but to have God fulfill me. And so in that way, I think a Christian can, like, live in the idea of, like, this self-partnership, maybe slightly, but it's, like, totally different at the same time. The other thing I was going to say about the Sinkies is I think that, again, England is, like, has different culture and subculture than the United States of America, but I feel like the integrating single people, especially young adults or adults who are single, into families and into churches or into other, like, groups of society, so that they feel included and aren't, like, alone all the time. That isn't happening very well, I don't think, in America. And so I think groups like the Sinkies are forming out of a necessity to have community. And I think that the church is starting to do a better job and can continue to do a much better job of being inclusive in that way, in making community not just centered around the nuclear family.
Yes. Man, I so appreciate that line of thought. And I think you're right. Like, the Sinkies, little did they know they were going to be famous on our podcast today.
Famous on our own. Yeah.
All 5 of our listeners will appreciate that.
I was going to say that, but then I was like, I'm not going to denigrate us. It's true, though.
Consider it done. But yeah, I think that there may be something to the Sinkies forming as a way to create this community and to fulfill that desire to be a part of something and to belong to something. And as I referenced earlier, I think firsthand I've experienced my church making some great effort and strides in this area. I won't, like, list every example, but man, almost every single Sunday there is a woman in the church, and a different woman at that, who will invite me to sit with her or her family in the pews. And, you know, like, that just means so much to me, because
that's so beautiful.
It is. It's kind of like there are no walls here. There is no in-group and out-group. Like, we're all part of the same group, and therefore it's really not a big deal for you to come and sit with my family and worship with us instead of sitting by yourself. And, you know, the reality is, it's not like I'm conversating with them during the service. Like, we're not really even interacting that much. It's literally this simple yet deep concept of belonging, being there together. So, yeah, I've appreciated that. There's women who have taken me out for meals, or just recently one who is really helping me get connected to a small group. And I definitely do not feel overlooked. I don't feel that I'm being shunned for being single. Not once has someone questioned, like, oh, why are you 25 and not dating anyone? Yeah, I really have felt like I have value that's outside of my relationship status, and I think that reflects the way that God sees each of us. And I really appreciate that my church family is making efforts to do that. And one thing, as we kind of start to wind down, one question that we wanted to ask is, how can we be encouraging a more exploratory and open attitude towards singleness? And I want to kick that off with this little anecdote. So a few Sundays ago at church, there was an elder giving the sermon, and it happened to be about singleness and marriage. And before he really said anything, he was like, I want to apologize on behalf of our church for the way that we have treated singles. I want to apologize for the way that we have told you sanctification happens best by being married to someone or by being a parent. I want to apologize for that's the one that comes to my mind most readily, but multiple things. And man, just the posture of humility in that, the posture of, hey, we see you, we know that there are challenges, that there's loneliness, acknowledging it versus keeping it, like approaching it as though it's taboo and shouldn't be talked about. I think that's a great start. And I don't want to just point fingers and say, like, all right, all you married people, listen up. You need to treat us singles like this. It's definitely a two-way street. I think we also have to be open to the possibility that we're not defined by being single or being married, and be willing to put ourselves into community or into different groups as someone who has inherent value. And so I think it goes both ways.
Yeah, I love how you phrased that, even of like being open to the possibility that we're not defined by being single or being married, because I think that is a very like gracious and approachable way of phrasing. Like, I have a very firm like answer to that personally, like with my convictions quite strong, but in talking, I think the question of like just having people, how can we encourage more exploratory and openness around talking about singleness and marriage and just, you know, all of that. I think how you phrased that was really approachable and like helps generate thinking, as opposed to some questions, depending on how you phrase them, can generate like defensiveness, like we've seen in some of these articles. And I think that's like rightfully, like people are rightfully like, hey, being single is like valid, like we're not lesser people. And it's unfortunate that there's been a tone in society of like on both sides of just, I don't know even how to summarize that. But yeah, I like how you phrase that question. And I think another thing, and this doesn't even just apply to singleness, this is just like life. Getting really existential over here. Asking questions instead of assuming, or, I mean, people are going to assume things no matter what, but like maintaining that like, oh, there's also a possibility that my assumption's wrong. And kind of, I can feel very misunderstood sometimes Especially if I'm like meeting someone new, like in whatever context, and it's like, oh, like you're 26, and it's like, oh, you don't have a wedding ring, and I just feel the weight of like, and maybe I'm assuming that they're assuming things about me, but like, yeah, just maintain, kind of going back to what you said of maintaining a posture of like open-handedness, like there's more to this than I probably realize.
And this like group just popped into my head that we briefly talked about earlier, but I want to put it out there too. I really appreciate and respect people who believe their calling is explicitly to be single, whether that's a lifelong calling or like in a season of life. And I think that's something to, like, I don't want to say be proud of, because again, that might be an unhealthy degree of elevating singleness. But yeah, I think it's a very valid way to live. And there's a ton of freedom. There's a ton of opportunities for serving and for making an impact and for meeting people where they're at, just because of the flexibility of being single. And often it's not just time flexibility. Sometimes it is financial flexibility or emotional flexibility, just having more to give to others. So for that group of people, I'm sorry if you felt a little bit left out of this discussion. Like, just wanting to validate people who really feel led into a life of singleness. And just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, guys, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Letting It Percolate. We hope that you connected with what we talked about in today's episode and that your thoughts have been sufficiently percolated. In the next episode, we'll be asking and answering the question, what misconceptions have we had about God? And we hope that you'll join us. So with that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.